Louisiana, 1843. Along the cypress-choked edges of the Bayou Teche, midwives began whispering about a color that did not belong. In cabins meant for darkness, children were being born with eyes like winter sky and hair pale as river ash. Not one, not twice, but again and again and again. At first, the planters called it coincidence, a trick of candlelight, a sickness of the mind. But coincidence does not repeat itself with such discipline. These children shared the same stillness, the same bone structure, the same unsettling calm. And most disturbing of all, no records named their fathers. Church baptism logs began showing blanks where names should be. Plantation ledgers were altered, pages torn out cleanly, as if by practiced hands. One priest wrote in the margin of a parish book, "This child carries the mark of another lineage." The entry was later burned. The enslaved mothers were forbidden to speak of it. Some were sold south within weeks. Others vanished into orphan houses run by the church, institutions that promised salvation and delivered silence. The children, however, remained, growing, watching. By 1850, entire parishes had adopted an unspoken rule: do not look too closely at the blonde ones. They were said to bring misfortune. Dogs refused to approach them. Mirrors were removed from rooms where they slept. And beneath it all lay a question that no one wrote down, but everyone feared. If these children all came from one father, what kind of man could leave the same shadow across so many lives? The answer waited in sealed rooms, behind pulpits, beneath crosses that had learned how to lie. By 1851, the question was no longer whispered, it was avoided. Plantation owners compared notes in locked studies, speaking in lowered voices not out of mercy, but fear. The births did not follow geography. They followed routes, river paths, church circuits, orphanage transfers. Wherever the same institutions touched the land, the same children appeared. Midwives noticed something else. The mothers did not describe violence the same way. There were no screams in their memories, no resistance. Instead, they spoke of authority, a voice that could not be refused, a presence introduced as holy, corrective, necessary, someone who arrived with scripture in one hand and silence in the other. The enslaved men were questioned, then punished, then erased from records entirely. But the timing never matched. The features never matched. And the children, those pale-eyed infants, grew with unsettling sameness, as if shaped by a single mold. The church issued explanations. Old European blood, they said, a rare inheritance. They reminded congregations that God's will often appear strange before it reveals its wisdom. Parishioners nodded, relieved to accept a lie that sounded learned. But a young deacon in St. Martinville began mapping baptisms in secret. He traced names, dates, and locations across 3 decades. What emerged was not a family tree, but a pattern of movement. One man, always passing through, never staying long, leaving behind donations, sermons, and children that did not belong. When the deacon attempted to file a formal inquiry, his letters were returned unopened. Weeks later, he was reassigned to a remote mission upriver. His replacement burned the maps. Still, rumors spread. The enslaved began calling the unseen figure Le Père Blanc, the White Father. Not because of his skin, but because wherever he went, color drained from the world, and something colder took its place. The children were never raised where they were born. That was the first rule no one admitted existed. Within months, sometimes weeks, of their arrival into the world, the pale-haired infants were removed from the quarters and carried into buildings labeled mercy. Orphan houses, church-run refuges, places where salvation was promised and questions were forbidden. On paper, these institutions were sanctuaries. Brick walls, whitewashed halls, Latin prayers etched into doorframes. In reality, they functioned like filters, separating what could be seen from what needed to be shaped. Caretakers noticed the children did not bond normally. They did not cry when left alone. They did not reach for comfort. Instead, they watched, always watching. Their eyes followed adults with an intelligence that felt misplaced, almost rehearsed. By age 5, many could recite scripture without being taught. Not memorized, understood. They asked questions no child should know how to form. About inheritance, about obedience, about why God demanded secrecy more often than truth. At night, the children sleepwalked in groups, bare feet on cold stone. always toward the same wing of the building, rooms sealed to everyone else. Rooms reserved for visiting clergy. Staff who interfered were reassigned. Some resigned abruptly. One caretaker wrote in her journal, "They are being prepared, not raised." That journal vanished. Local towns began noticing something worse. Fires broke out after the children left. Marriages collapsed. Men who opposed church authority suffered sudden ruin. Lost land, lost sons, lost faith. Coincidence, again, was offered as explanation. But the enslaved mothers understood. They had seen the Father's eyes. They had felt the stillness that came before obedience. Whatever had touched them was now multiplying, refined through walls built of prayer and silence. The orphan houses did not exist to hide the children. They existed to finish them. And somewhere beyond the locked doors, the White Father returned, checking his work. By the late 1850s, something subtle began to shift in the parishes touched by the orphan houses. Sermons changed first. Priests who had once preached mercy now spoke of purity, not of the soul, but of lineage. They warned congregations that God favored order over chaos, silence over confession, obedience over love. These words were never written down. They were delivered slowly, carefully, like instructions meant only for those who already understood. Congregants reported an unusual reaction to these sermons. People did not feel inspired. They felt emptied, as if something had been taken rather than given. Marriages became sterile. Women miscarried without explanation. Men lost the ability to pray without trembling. Doctors blamed fever. The church blamed sin. But midwives noticed a chilling pattern. Wherever the sermons took root, only one kind of child thrived. Those with pale hair and blue eyes, born to women who never named a father. These children were favored publicly, given better food, better education. They were placed at the front of the pews, dressed in white, asked to lead hymns in voices unervingly calm. The congregation called them blessed. Behind closed doors, they were taught different lessons. They were instructed on how to command without raising their voice, how to make people comply while believing it was their own idea, how to recognize weakness, not as a flaw, but as an opportunity. One former seminarian later confessed that these lessons were called the quiet gospel. He described a tall cleric who oversaw them, always hooded, always gloved, his face never fully visible. The man spoke rarely. When he did, the room went silent without being asked. The seminarian tried to leave. His recommendation papers were denied. His family lost their land within a year. He vanished soon after. The White Father was no longer creating children. He was creating inheritance. And Louisiana was becoming its cradle. In 1861, as war fractured the nation above ground, something else was being carefully preserved below it. Beneath the altar of a rural Louisiana church, one spared from looting, fire, or shelling, a hidden ledger was kept. It was not a book of sins. It was a book of outcomes. Names of women appeared without surnames. Dates of birth were listed beside symbols instead of fathers' names. Crosses, circles, lines drawn through ink as if to erase blood itself. Each entry ended with a single word written in a different hand, confirmed. The ledger tracked the children. It recorded where they were sent, who raised them, and, most disturbing of all, how they changed others. Notes appeared in margins years later. Subject shows influence. Resistance dissolved. Community compliant. The war should have disrupted everything. It did not. Plantations burned, armies passed, flags changed, but the orphan houses remained untouched. Soldiers reported feeling uneasy near them. Horses refused to drink from nearby wells. Chaplains avoided the buildings without knowing why. After the war, formerly enslaved families searched desperately for lost children. They were turned away with paperwork stamped and signed. Deaths were recorded without graves. Adoptions were approved without witnesses. One mother claimed she recognized her son in a church procession, taller, pale-haired, dressed in clerical white. When she called his name, he did not turn. A priest gently asked her to leave. She disappeared before nightfall. The ledger continued to grow. It did not record love, or care, or faith. It recorded control, measured not in years, but in generations. And every page ended the same way, with a symbol pressed so hard into the paper it nearly tore through. A cross with no figure upon it. By the 1870s, towns along the bayou began noticing a quiet impossibility. The children were growing, but not changing. A boy seen leading hymns at age 8 was still leading them 20 years later, his face altered only by height, his eyes unchanged, pale and distant. A girl who assisted nuns in an orphan house was remembered across 3 generations of parishioners, each convinced they had known her in their youth. Photographs deepened the unease. Sepia portraits taken decades apart showed the same faces appearing in different roles: altar boys, catechists, clerks, teachers, always present, never central, never gone. The church explained it away as coincidence. Family resemblance, they said. The blessing of good health. But local people began avoiding eye contact with them. Children were warned not to speak to the pale ones alone. Old women crossed themselves when they passed. Doctors were called in secretly. One physician recorded that their pulse was slower than normal, their skin cooler, their responses delayed, as if measured against something unseen before answering. He wrote that examining them felt like listening for a heartbeat in a building rather than a body. That doctor lost his license within the year. The White Father returned during this time. Older, perhaps, or perhaps unchanged. Always moving, always inspecting. Those who claimed to see his face disagreed on its details, but all described the same sensation: submission before fear. People obeyed him without knowing why. These children were not immortal. They were maintained. Their purpose was not to live forever, but to remain long enough to pass something on. Influence, authority, silence. They married selectively. They entered law, education, and the clergy. They left no trace of where they came from, only certainty wherever they stood. Louisiana was not being haunted. It was being cultivated, and the harvest had begun. Not everyone forgot. In the low country beyond the parishes, where the church's reach weakened and records thinned, there lived women who remembered everything. Formerly enslaved, aging, dismissed as superstitious or bitter, but their memories aligned too precisely to ignore. They spoke of the same man. He came at night or during prayer hours. He did not force doors. He was always expected, introduced by overseers, by priests, by letters bearing seals. The women said the air grew heavy when he entered. Lamps dimmed. Time slowed. He spoke gently, as if correcting a child, and they obeyed without resistance. Afterwards, they felt nothing. No pain, no shame. Only a hollow certainty that something had been taken and replaced. They remembered his scent. Old paper, incense, iron. When they tried to tell others, they were punished or dismissed. When they named the church, they were accused of blasphemy. When they described his eyes, light, colorless, reflective, they were told they had imagined it. But these women noticed something crucial. Their children did not recognize them. Even when placed in the same town, even when spoken to directly, the children's eyes slid past them as if past a stranger. Not cold, emptied, as if the memory of the mother had been deliberately erased to make room for something else. One woman claimed her son returned years later as a parish official. She showed him the scar on his arm she had given him as a baby. He examined it carefully, nodded politely, and called for assistance to escort her away. They were taught not to remember us, she said, because remembering would make them human. These mothers gathered quietly. They prayed, not to the church's God, but to memory itself. They passed stories like contraband. They understood the truth long before historians would have language for it. The White Father had not only stolen their children, he had rewritten inheritance, and the mothers were the last witnesses left alive. In 1889, a new seminary opened on elevated ground outside Lafayette. Officially, it trained clergy for rural parishes. Unofficially, it accepted students without histories. No birth certificates, no family names, no questions. Young men arrived by riverboat or carriage, carrying only letters of recommendation sealed with a symbol the local printers claimed they had never engraved. The students were nearly identical in bearing: upright posture, pale hair, light eyes, controlled speech. They did not socialize with townspeople. They did not attend festivals. They did not write letters home, because there was no home to write to. The curriculum was unusual. Theology was taught alongside rhetoric, law, and something referred to only as stewardship of influence. Students learned how institutions bend, how communities accept guidance when framed as protection, how fear can be administered quietly, without spectacle. At night, the seminary held closed sessions. Bells were rung without sound. Candles were burned without flame. A visiting cleric presided, tall, always veiled in shadow. He never taught directly. He corrected. Those who failed correction were not expelled. They simply left. Their names were removed from rosters. Their rooms reassigned. No one asked where they went. Graduates were placed strategically. Some entered the priesthood. Others became judges, educators, archivists. Men who understood process, not passion. Men who could decide what was recorded and what was forgotten. One local journalist attempted to investigate the seminary. He was invited for a tour. He described the visit as polite, orderly, and deeply unsettling. His final article was never published. The printing press burned the same night. The seminary did not produce monsters. It produced managers of silence. And at the center of it all, never named, never photographed, stood the White Father, ensuring that his lineage would not be recognized as blood, but as authority. By 1907, one Louisiana town simply vanished. Not physically. The buildings remained. The roads led where they always had. But ask anyone nearby about the town of Bellefonte, and their answers fractured. Some said it had burned. Others insisted it was renamed. Most grew uneasy and changed the subject. Bellefonte sat between two orphan houses and a river crossing. Census records showed a stable population, until one year, when every household listed the same profession: church service. Teachers, clerks, deputies, even bakers, all affiliated. Visitors described the town as calm to the point of paralysis. No arguments. No laughter. No children playing. Bells rang on schedule. People moved when instructed. Smiles appeared only when expected. A traveling photographer took pictures. When the plates were developed, the people appeared blurred, as if caught mid-motion despite standing still. Only the pale-haired parish officials were sharply defined. The photographer left town shaken. Weeks later, his memory of Bellefonte began dissolving. He recalled faces, but not names. Streets, but not directions. His notes ended with a single line: "It functions without thought." When state inspectors arrived, they found immaculate records and no irregularities. No crimes. No complaints. No history of births that could be traced. The town complied perfectly. That was the problem. Within a decade, Bellefonte was absorbed administratively into surrounding parishes. Its name stopped appearing on maps. Its archives were relocated, then lost. Its church was deconsecrated quietly. What remained was a template, a demonstration of what happens when an entire community is raised under one lineage of influence. When memory is replaced by structure. When humanity is exchanged for order. Bellefonte was not destroyed. It was completed, and the White Father moved on, leaving behind a town that no longer needed him. In 1914, a diary surfaced in the attic of a defunct orphanage along the Teche River. It belonged to a young caretaker, only 16 at the time of her employment, and the handwriting was precise, almost unnatural. What she recorded was not intended for anyone. Yet the pages survived decades, hidden beneath floorboards. She wrote of children who did not age normally. Children who, when spoken to, answered with phrases that seemed lifted from sermons they had not yet been taught. They corrected her grammar, her posture, her gestures. She described a boy with hair like straw and eyes like frozen water, who would walk calmly to a corner and wait. Always waiting. For what? She could not know. The diary detailed nights when the children left their beds and moved as a group, silent and purposeful. She described a cloaked figure overseeing them, face hidden, presence undeniable. She wrote that when he spoke, even the wind seemed to pause. But the most chilling entry was near the end. I asked one of the children why he does not cry when he is hurt. He looked at me and said, "Because I am not yours. I was never yours." And I understood that he belonged to something older than this house, older than our God, older than time. The diary ends abruptly. The caretaker disappears from all records in the following year. The pages were never published. The orphanage was quietly shut down, the children reassigned. Those who read the diary later reported sleepless nights and an instinctive need to avoid certain towns. They spoke of a presence watching through empty rooms, a feeling that the children, and perhaps the father, had anticipated their curiosity and had already judged it. The diary existed as evidence of one truth. The lineages of the White Father were alive, even if the world chose to forget them. The Bayou Teche did not forget. Locals spoke in hushed tones about the river as if it were sentient. It carried more than water. It carried whispers, reflections of shadows, and traces of the children the White Father had touched. Canoes drifted past abandoned cabins and orphan houses, and sometimes, just sometimes, a pale figure would appear at the water's edge. Not running, not playing, just standing, waiting, observing. Fishermen told stories of nets that tore on nothing, boats that grounded on invisible banks. The river itself seemed to guide, or warn, those who approached the orphan houses. Children were never seen playing in the water, but footprints led from shore to nowhere. Wet sand hardened as if a hand had pressed it down and vanished. During floods, records, ledgers, diaries, parish books were sometimes found washed into the water. Pages clung to driftwood, mud-stained, partially illegible. What remained always pointed back to one pattern: pale-haired children. Baptism dates. Names of mothers, erased. Symbols instead of fathers. Notes on obedience and influence. Some who attempted to follow the river to its source claimed they felt a presence guiding them back, cold and patient, like a parent ensuring no curiosity escaped its reach. Families reported loved ones returning from searches in a daze, silent for days, their dreams filled with voices reciting scripture in languages they had never studied. And yet, the river did not destroy. It preserved. It carried memory where men refused to keep it. The Bayou Teche knew that nothing born of the White Father could ever truly be lost. And the river, patient as centuries, waited for the next child. By 1922, families desperate to reclaim their children tried writing letters. Mothers, fathers, distant relatives, they poured their hearts into paper and ink. But the letters never arrived. Not a single one. Postmasters along the bayou later reported strange anomalies. Mailboxes sealed themselves. Letters returned with no postmark. Sometimes envelopes were found in piles of old river debris, soaked and empty, the ink dissolved as if by design. Those few letters that did reach the orphan houses were never delivered to the children. Clerks recorded that the envelopes had vanished from their hands. A journalist named William Hawthorne attempted to investigate. He wrote letters to every known parish, requesting records of children born with pale hair and blue eyes. Months later, he received a single reply, typed on a sheet of thin parchment, and signed, bearing only a faint symbol of a cross without a figure. The message read simply, "We do not exist where you believe we do. Seek elsewhere." Hawthorne became obsessed. He traveled the Teche River, knocking on orphan houses, churches, and seminaries. He claimed to see children peering at him from shadows, noting him. They never spoke, only watched. Once, a pale-eyed boy smiled at him. Hawthorne described it as a smile that knew his thoughts before he did. Within months, Hawthorne vanished. His belongings were found at the riverbank. Papers scattered. Journal entries unfinished. Locals swore they saw a tall, cloaked figure silently guiding him back toward Bellefonte before he disappeared. The letters were never delivered. The truth was never read. And the children remained. Some messages, it seems, are never meant to arrive. By 1930, a discreet boarding school appeared near the outskirts of New Orleans. Its facade was ordinary: brick walls, neatly trimmed lawns, and iron gates. But its curriculum was anything but. The students were always pale-haired, blue-eyed, and unervingly composed. No one questioned their presence. They had no families, no backstories. No one remembered where they came from. Inside, the lessons were carefully orchestrated. Mathematics and history were taught alongside something darker: the art of influence. How to guide a town without speaking. How to enforce obedience without punishment. How to predict fear in others before it surfaced. Teachers who tried to alter the curriculum found themselves reassigned or quietly dismissed. Some disappeared without explanation. Parents of local children noticed the pale students always achieved perfect discipline, even when not supervised. By night, students attended clandestine sessions led by a shadowed figure, known only as the instructor. No one ever saw his face, only his presence. He would walk among them silently, occasionally touching a child's shoulder. Those touched would leave with a perfection of posture, a calm in their voice, a strange detachment from normal emotion. One local doctor, called to examine a student who collapsed from apparent exhaustion, recorded, "The child's pulse is steady. Respiration slow. Awareness seems diverted but focused. Not asleep. Not conscious in a normal sense. Something else entirely." Graduates left the school into positions of subtle authority: administration, clergy, law enforcement, education, shaping society quietly, invisibly. The White Father had vanished from public view, but his legacy of control was now institutionalized. Louisiana was no longer just a landscape of forgotten children. It was a laboratory for obedience. In 1937, a rare event occurred that would echo across parishes. A pale-haired child, unusually tall for his age, was brought to a small rural church for baptism. The ceremony seemed ordinary until the priest, mid-rite, hesitated. The child did not tremble. He did not cry. He stared directly at the altar, as if assessing the priest himself. When the water touched his head, the candles flickered. The choir froze mid-note. One parishioner later described the air as thick, like a living presence had entered the room. No records of the child's mother or father existed. The godparents were strangers, assigned by the orphanage. Yet the baptism proceeded, quietly noted in a ledger that no one dared touch. Afterward, whispers spread. The child could recite prayers he had never learned. He could repeat sermons from decades prior. He corrected elders on their pronunciation of Latin phrases. Yet, unlike other children, he smiled with a hint of knowledge too ancient for youth. A visiting cleric attempted to question him. The child's eyes met his and seemed to measure obedience. Later, the cleric refused to speak about the encounter. He left Louisiana, but letters from him arrived months later, fragmented and incoherent. This baptism marked a subtle shift. The children were no longer simply hidden or controlled. They were being tested. The White Father's line was evolving, learning not only to obey but to dominate without visible force. From that day, the parish became unusually quiet. Animals avoided the church grounds. The river reflected distorted images. Townspeople noticed shadows moving independently of their owners. The White Father's influence was no longer just a secret. It was a presence, watching, waiting, shaping everything in its path. In 1942, construction workers uncovered an unmarked cemetery along a forgotten bend of the Teche River. Gravestones, if they could be called that, were carved with symbols instead of names. Crosses without figures. Circles intersected by lines. Dates that did not match any known births or deaths. Local historians attempted to catalog it. Every attempt was thwarted. Photographs developed blank where the stones should have appeared. Papers recorded today were missing tomorrow. Workers reported hearing faint chanting at night, although the site had been sealed and abandoned for decades. Among the remains, one stood out. A tiny coffin, unassuming, with a delicate gold cross. Inside, a child with hair pale as ash and eyes still unblinking. There were no signs of decay. The local coroner refused to open it. "Some things are not meant to be known," he whispered. Neighbors reported disturbances afterward. Lights flickering in abandoned buildings, faint music echoing along empty roads, and children appearing in windows that had long been boarded. Adults began avoiding the area entirely. The cemetery, once forgotten, had become a locus of memory and control. It recorded lineage, influence, and obedience. Those who had once vanished, children, clerics, witnesses, were said to have returned in spectral form to watch over the living. And still, the White Father remained unseen. He no longer needed to intervene directly. His legacy had become self-perpetuating, codified in symbols, buildings, and the unnatural calm of the children who survived him. Louisiana's forgotten corners held the truth. Those who are born under the Father's gaze never truly die, and neither do the rules he imposed. In 1946, a young history teacher named Eleanor March arrived at a small school near the bayou. She was known for curiosity and for asking questions adults preferred left unspoken. Eleanor quickly noticed the students, pale-haired, blue-eyed, unnervingly composed. They recited history with precise diction, memorized events decades before she had learned them, and corrected her factual errors without hesitation. One child even explained the outcome of a presidential election that hadn't yet occurred. She attempted to investigate their origins. Local archives refused access. Parish records were incomplete, missing pages. Diaries disappeared. Even neighbors refused to speak, shifting uneasily at the mention of the children. Eleanor began keeping her own notes. She recorded the strange behavior, the unnatural composure, the pattern of the children's appearances along the river, the orphanages, and the seminaries. She wrote of a man she never saw directly, a presence that made teachers pause mid-sentence, students straighten instinctively, and dogs bark in fear. One night, she stayed late to observe. She watched the children gather in the courtyard, walking in synchronized silence, staring toward a building she had not noticed before. A shadowed figure emerged and inspected each child. Eleanor was seen. The figure turned toward her. She fled, but when she returned the next morning, the building had vanished. Her journals were never found. Neighbors claimed she had left town, though no train or bus records existed. Only a single note remained in the school's records. She saw too much. By then, the White Father's reach was no longer limited to children. He was now shaping those who sought the truth, erasing them, ensuring that memory itself remained under control. In 1948, the town of Bayou St. Martin prepared for its annual festival. It had once been a lively event, music spilling into the streets, children laughing, families gathering. But that year, something felt wrong. The pale-haired children appeared in the parade, perfectly aligned, faces serene, voices synchronized. They moved without hesitation, correcting each other's steps, guiding townspeople subtly yet inexorably. Ordinary children who tried to join were politely but firmly steered away. Adults noticed an unnerving calm, a quiet compliance unlike anything they had experienced before. That night, the festival was recorded by a local photographer. When the images were developed, the townspeople outside the parade were blurred, their movements appearing ghostly, while the pale-haired children remained unnaturally sharp. No one remembered any part of the festival afterward. Accounts from neighboring towns contradicted each other. Travelers who had attended could not agree on dates, locations, or events. A lone musician, who claimed to have heard a hidden melody leading the children, disappeared the following week. His family insisted he had simply left town, though no one saw him depart. The White Father was never seen at the festival, yet his presence was everywhere. He did not need to walk among the people. The lineages he had cultivated had already learned the language of obedience, influence, and silent authority. By morning, the festival was erased from memory, existing only in the unseen ledger of the Father's legacy. Louisiana had learned a terrifying truth. Some events are designed not to be remembered, only to propagate control. In 1949, a seminary archivist uncovered a hidden ledger beneath the floorboards of the old Bellefonte parish. Its pages were brittle, edges blackened, symbols etched into the margins rather than words. Some scholars later described the ink as almost alive, shimmering faintly under candlelight. The ledger recorded every child born with pale hair and blue eyes over the past century. Dates, locations, orphan houses, seminaries, assignments in towns. Each entry ended with one word, compliant. Some pages contained notes about their influence, subtle interventions in towns, marriages, elections, and churches. Others detailed failures, with blank spaces where children had disappeared, never to be accounted for. Most chilling were the whispered entries in a different hand, barely legible. They are aware. They know. And they will wait. When the archivist attempted to catalog the ledger, he found that the entries shifted overnight. Symbols moved. Pages altered. The ledger seemed to anticipate inquiry, responding as though alive. Objects in the room shifted slightly, chairs repositioned, doors left ajar when they had been closed. Those who tried to leave with the ledger reported disorientation. Roads curved unexpectedly. Memories of nearby towns became hazy. Some even swore they heard children singing in the wind, voices precise and commanding, repeating prayers and instructions they had never learned. By the time the archivist vanished, just a whisper in town records, the ledger remained, waiting for the next hand brave or foolish enough to touch it. The White Father had long disappeared, but the ledger proved one undeniable truth. His reach was eternal, coded into the lives he shaped, the children who carried him forward, and the land that remembered what men refused to. In 1950, an elderly woman named Amélie Broussard remained among the few who remembered the earliest days. She had been a midwife, a mother, and a secret chronicler of the White Father's work. Her hands were gnarled, her eyes sharp, and her memory unyielding. Amélie spoke of the children's births, the orphan houses, the seminaries, and the seminary's silent graduates. She described the Father not as a man, but as a presence that bent wills and reshaped reality, moving unseen yet omnipresent. He left behind not monsters, but architects of control, children who grew to command without question, influence without detection. She recounted the first ledger, burned in secrecy, and the later ledger hidden beneath Belfont Parish. She warned that the children, now adults, were everywhere, in schools, churches, courts, and towns. They were indistinguishable from ordinary citizens, yet their obedience to an unseen authority ensured the father's lineage persisted. Amelie tried to warn outsiders. Letters, whispers, and secret meetings. Few believed her. One local reporter wrote her off as eccentric, dismissing her as haunted by memory. But her voice carried a final plea. The White Father is gone, yes, but he taught them everything. Watch the Pale Ones. Observe their calm, their precision, their silence. They will not tell you who they serve, but they serve still. Amelie died quietly in her home near the Teche River. Her house was left undisturbed for years. Some say, if one walks past at dusk, a faint light glows in her window, as though she continues to watch over the lineage she once tried to protect. Her testimony became the last thread of memory. Without it, history would have forgotten the children and the man who made them instruments of his will. By 1950, Louisiana had transformed quietly, its rivers, towns, and orphan houses carrying the imprint of the White Father. His children were no longer children. They were adults who walked among society, unremarkable yet deeply aligned. They taught, judged, guided, and observed, shaping towns without proclamation, influencing generations without notice. No history books recorded them. No newspapers chronicled their movements. Yet their impact was everywhere. Marriages, education, local governance, even law enforcement, small decisions accumulating over decades to enforce order, obedience, and subtle control. A smile, a gesture, a correction, a look from a pale-eyed individual could realign an entire family's decisions without explanation. The father himself was gone, or so it appeared. Those who sought him found empty seminaries, orphan houses locked or burned, and letters returned unopened. But his influence was encoded into the lineage he had crafted, passed down not through names, but through obedience, memory, and subtle authority. Occasionally, locals swore the White Father still walked the Teche River at dusk. Others claimed to hear whispered instructions in abandoned chapels or see shadows of pale-haired figures moving in synchrony along empty streets. Even the land seemed aware, preserving the memory of what it had witnessed, bending nature to serve as both witness and protector of secrets. Louisiana's secret was clear. Some legacies are not written in ink or blood. They are lived, silently, invisibly, carried forward by those who will obey without question. The pale-eyed children were not anomalies. They were the Father's inheritance. And though decades would pass, though the world would change around them, the influence would never end. Somewhere, unseen, in the quiet corners of parishes and along shadowed rivers, the line continues, shaping, guiding, and waiting. The White Father may be gone, but his children and his control remain.